The hall looked exactly the way my daughter had described it. The chandeliers, the cream-colored table linens, the little sprigs of eucalyptus tucked into every centerpiece. She'd shown me the photos from the venue brochure months ago, sitting at my kitchen table, eyes wide with excitement. I'd smiled and said it was beautiful. I meant it. What I hadn't expected was that I would be standing in that same hall, 63 years old, with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, listening to the room fill with laughter at my expense. Not polite laughter, not the kind that gets away from people by accident, the kind that builds, one person catching it from another, spreading table to table like something rehearsed. And my wife was laughing too. I want to be honest about what that felt like. I've tried to find a softer way to say it, and there isn't one. It felt like the floor dropped out from under me, cleanly, without warning. My name is not important. What matters is this: I am 63 years old. I came to this country from Newfoundland when I was 22 with a trade certificate and a duffel bag, and I spent 40 years building something out of nothing. Not a dramatic something, just a solid, reliable life. A house in Kitchener that I paid off in full by the time I was 55. A small landscaping company that I eventually sold, a retirement that was modest but mine. I met my wife at a community barbecue in the summer of 2009. She was funny and warm, and she had 2 daughters from her first marriage. The younger one, who would have been about 12 at the time, barely looked up from her phone. The older one, the one who would become the center of the story, shook my hand firmly and said, "My mom talks about you." She was 16. She seemed like a good kid. We got married 2 years later. I want to say it was easy, blending into their lives. It wasn't, but I tried. I showed up to school events and drove people to hockey practice and learned how to make the older one's favorite pasta, the baked kind with the breadcrumbs on top. I didn't try to be their father. Their father was still in the picture in his way. I just tried to be present. What I didn't fully understand then was that being present over time gets redefined. It stops meaning he's here and starts meaning he'll handle it. And I didn't push back on that. That's on me, in part. I know that now. When my stepdaughter, I'll call her that for simplicity, got engaged 4 years ago, the conversation about the wedding started almost immediately. She and her fiancé had been together for 3 years. He was a decent man. He worked in logistics, lived carefully, had a mother in Mississauga who made pierogies from scratch, and never asked for anything from anyone. The first number that came up was $60,000. My wife brought it up at dinner one night, the way she sometimes brought up difficult things, embedded inside a normal conversation, almost as an aside. She's thinking the venue deposit alone is going to be around $12,000. Isn't that something? I said it was something, yes. Of course, they'll cover what they can, she said, but you know how these things go. I said I was familiar with how these things went. That was how it started. Over the following months, the number shifted. First it was $65,000. Then it was $72 because they'd upgraded the dinner service. Then it was closer to $80 because the original photographer had cancelled and the replacement cost considerably more. Each time, a version of the same conversation. My wife telling me what was needed, me asking questions that didn't get fully answered, and then a transfer going through from my account. I want to be clear about something. I was not a reluctant participant in the early stages. I have a stepdaughter who was getting married. I wanted to do something meaningful. The first $20,000 I gave freely. I didn't keep score. It was only later, when the requests became less like requests and more like invoices, that I started to feel it. And even then, I didn't say much. My wife would say I never say much, and she'd be right. What I noticed, though, was that I was never asked. Not really. I was informed. There's a difference, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The florist needs a deposit by Friday. The caterer is going to require an additional fee for the late bar. I told them we'd cover it. She found this incredible lighting company out of Toronto. It's a bit more, but it transforms the whole room. I kept paying. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, I had put in just over $86,000. My wife's contribution was the dress, which I had also partially funded through a shared account. I don't need to get into. Her ex-husband, the biological father, had contributed nothing. I know this not because anyone told me, but because I'd seen the numbers. I'd asked once early on how they planned to split costs, and my wife had said something vague about his situation being complicated. I didn't press. I'd like to say I arrived at that wedding feeling generous and light. I didn't. I arrived feeling tired. But I got dressed in my good suit, the navy one I bought for my nephew's wedding in Halifax, and I drove my wife to the venue, and I watched her walk in looking radiant, and I thought, let's just get through this beautifully. The ceremony was in a small chapel attached to the event hall. It was lovely, actually. My stepdaughter looked stunning. Her fiancé cried when he saw her, the good kind of crying, and I felt something loosen in my chest for a moment. This was why you do things for people, not to be thanked, just for the moment when it works. The reception began well. I found my seat, not at the head table, which was fine. I hadn't expected that, but at a table near the back with my wife's aunt and her husband, a retired schoolteacher from Burlington named Terrence, who turned out to be excellent company. We talked about hockey and the state of the 401 and whether the Leafs would ever sort themselves out. Then came the speeches. My wife's mother went first. She is a woman in her late 70s who has, over the years, made it quietly but consistently clear that she considers me an acceptable inconvenience. She's never been openly hostile. She just has a way of looking at me that contains an entire editorial. Her speech was fine, mostly. Stories about my stepdaughter as a child, a few jokes about the groom's family, the usual, and then she paused, tilted her head toward the microphone, and said something that I will not forget as long as I am alive. Now, I know a few of you are wondering how we put together such a beautiful evening on such short notice. She smiled. Well, let's just say we have a very generous stepfather. The way she said it, the pause before the word, the small, knowing smile. The room laughed. Not all of it, maybe a third, but it spread. I heard it move. And then I looked at my wife. She had her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She was laughing. I set down my fork. I don't know what I looked like in that moment. Probably nothing dramatic. I'd been told I have a face that doesn't show much. But inside, something that had been bending for a very long time finally bent past the point it could spring back. What happened next I did not expect. The groom's younger brother, a man of about 28 named Patrick, who I had met only twice before, stood up from his chair. Not to give a speech. He hadn't been scheduled to speak. He just stood up quietly and asked if he could say something. There was a ripple of confusion. My stepdaughter looked at her new husband, who looked at Patrick with an expression I couldn't read. Patrick took the microphone from the stand. I'm not going to keep this long, he said. I just want to say something because I don't think I'll be able to sit here comfortably if I don't. The room went very quiet. I've spent the last few days with this family, he said, and I've learned something. The man sitting at table 9, my brother's new stepfather-in-law, I suppose, which is quite a title. He paused, and there was a small, gentle laugh, nothing like the earlier one, has paid for essentially everything you're enjoying tonight. The food, the flowers, the lights that are making everyone look better than they actually do. Another small laugh. And I just watched this room laugh at a joke made at his expense, and I don't think that's right. He set the microphone back in the stand and sat down. You could have heard a pin drop on that carpet. I looked at my wife. The laughter was gone from her face. In its place was something I couldn't name. Not quite shame, not quite anger. Something in between. My stepdaughter was looking at the tablecloth. Her mother, the grandmother, was looking at her water glass. I excused myself from the table and walked to the coat check. I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that hallway. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt exactly. It was something quieter and more clarifying. Like when you've been in a room that's too warm for a very long time and someone opens a window and you realize only in that moment how close to suffocating you were. I retrieved my coat. I found a quiet corner near the emergency exit doors. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the catering manager. I explained that I had authorized certain additions to the evening service, the extended open bar, the late-night snack station, the upgraded dessert display, and that I would be withdrawing that authorization. I understood if there were complications. I was happy to discuss them. The manager, to his credit, was composed about it. He said he would need a few minutes to sort out what was possible. The second call was to the venue coordinator. I had arranged as a surprise for a fireworks display on the property at 10 o'clock. Small but professionally done. $1,200. I told her to cancel it. She asked if everything was all right. I said that it was. I thanked her for her work that evening. It had been a beautiful venue. Then I sat in that hallway for a while and looked at the exit sign above the door. My wife found me 20 minutes later. She came around the corner looking flushed, her heels clicking on the tile, and when she saw me sitting on the bench, she stopped. "What are you doing?" she said. "Sitting," I said. "People are asking where you are." "Who?" I asked. Not combatively. I genuinely wanted to know. She didn't answer that directly. She sat down beside me. For a moment neither of us spoke. "She didn't mean it as an insult," she said finally. "My mother, you know how she is." "I do," I said. "That's the thing. I've known how she is for 13 years, and I kept writing checks anyway." My wife looked at her hands. "I need you to come back in," she said. "I know you do," I said. I didn't go back in. Not that night. I drove home, which took 40 minutes on the 401, and I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the overhead light off, just the small light above the stove, the way I always do when I can't sleep. I looked at the backyard. I'd built the deck myself 12 years ago. Pressure-treated lumber, done properly. It had weathered well. I thought about a lot of things that night. I thought about my father, who had worked 35 years at a paper mill in Corner Brook and never once complained. I thought about how I had always read that as a model. This is what men do. They show up. They carry things. They don't make a fuss. I thought about how somewhere along the way that model had been quietly borrowed and applied to me by people who hadn't earned the right to borrow it. I thought about my stepdaughter when she was 16, shaking my hand and saying, "My mum talks about you." I thought about how much I had wanted to be good at this, to be the kind of man who could walk into a complicated situation and make it better just by being steady and reliable. I thought about $86,000 and how not one person had ever looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you, we know what this cost you." My wife came home at midnight. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "The fireworks didn't happen," she said. "No," I said, "they didn't." She sat down across from me. She looked tired and sad and maybe a little frightened, which I had not seen from her in a long time. She said, "I should have said something. When she made that joke, I should have said something right away." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I don't know why I laughed. I think it caught me off guard, and "You don't have to explain it," I said. "I understand it. I just need you to understand what it meant to me." We talked for a long time that night. Not the way couples argue. Not that. More like two people who have been walking in the same direction for a long time and have finally stopped to look at where they are. I told her that I'd never asked to be invisible. I told her that I'd tried for 13 years to be useful and present and generous, and that somewhere in there those things had stopped being noticed and started being expected. I told her that I understood she didn't set out for it to happen that way, but it had happened. She cried. I did not. I had done my crying somewhere else, some other night in some accumulated way that didn't announce itself. In the weeks that followed, things were quiet between us, not hostile, just quiet. My stepdaughter called me 8 days after the wedding. She called me, not her mother, me directly. She asked if I could come for coffee. I drove to her apartment in Guelph, the one her husband and I had both helped her move into 2 years ago, and we sat at her kitchen table with mugs of coffee that were too hot to drink. She said, "I'm sorry, I need to say that first. What my grandmother said and the way the room responded, that was wrong, and I should have stood up in that moment, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." I looked at her. I believed her. That's the thing about my stepdaughter. She's always had a particular quality of directness that I'd respected, even when it was turned towards something uncomfortable. She got it from her mother, actually. Her mother has it too, on her better days. I didn't know, she said, the full amount. I knew you were helping significantly. I didn't know it was everything. It doesn't matter now, I said. It does matter, she said, and I want you to know that what you did, it wasn't nothing to us, even if we didn't show it. That's a failure on our part, and I own that. I nodded. We talked for 2 hours. I left feeling something had shifted, not fixed, but shifted. My wife and I spent the following months having conversations we probably should have had years earlier. About money, yes, but also about what I had needed from her that I hadn't been getting, about what she had assumed I was fine with because I'd never said otherwise, about the difference between a man who is steady and a man who is simply not speaking. She told me during one of those conversations that she had spent her first marriage watching her ex-husband react to everything loudly and dramatically, and that she had come to read my silence as peace. She hadn't understood it was sometimes a different kind of noise. I understood that. I didn't forgive the laughter easily, but I understood it. We're still together. I want to say that clearly, because I think some people assume that a story like this has to end with a door closing. It doesn't have to. We're still together, and things are different now. Not perfect, just more honest, which in my experience is more durable than perfect. What changed specifically is this. I stopped writing blank checks. Literally and in every other sense, I stopped volunteering to carry things before anyone asked. I started saying, plainly, what I needed and what I wouldn't do, and I stopped apologizing for having needs in the first place. My wife's mother has never addressed what she said. She probably never will. I stopped expecting her to. Patrick, the groom's brother, I ran into at a family dinner 6 months after the wedding. He came over and shook my hand and didn't say anything about that night. He didn't need to. I bought him a beer and we talked about the Blue Jays, and that was enough. My stepdaughter and her husband come for dinner on the last Sunday of most months. She brings dessert. I make the baked pasta with the breadcrumbs on top. Her husband always takes seconds, which I appreciate more than he knows. Last spring, I re-stanned the deck, spent a Saturday afternoon on my knees in the sun, working the stain into the boards with a brush, doing the edges properly, the way my father always said, if you're going to do a thing, do it right. My wife brought me a glass of iced tea around 3 in the afternoon. She set it on the railing and watched me work for a moment. Looks good, she said. It'll last another 10 years, I said. She stayed for a while, standing in the afternoon light, and I kept working, and it was quiet, and it was good. That's the part nobody tells you about getting older. The noise doesn't stop, the hard things don't stop. But somewhere after 60, you start to know the difference between things that deserve your silence and things that deserve your voice, and once you know the difference, you can't unknow it. I am 63 years old. I built a deck that will outlast the argument, and I know when to speak, and I finally know when to stop paying for things that cost me more than money. I've been thinking about that deck a lot lately. Not because it's anything special, pressure-treated lumber, a Saturday afternoon, the kind of job any careful man could do, but there's something about the way it's held up over the years that keeps coming back to me. I did it right the first time, and so it lasted. And I think that's the truest thing I know about how life works, if I'm being honest. What happened at that wedding hall in the fall wasn't an accident. It was the result of a long chain of small choices, mine and theirs. My mother-in-law didn't say what she said out of nowhere. She said it because, for 13 years, the conditions had quietly allowed it. I had made myself easy to dismiss, not because I was weak. I don't think I was weak, but because I confused generosity with invisibility, and I let that confusion go on too long. That's the part I had to sit with, the part that belonged to me. I think about Patrick sometimes, a young man I barely knew, who stood up in a room full of people and said the thing that needed saying, simply because he couldn't sit comfortably and stay quiet. There was something in that, a kind of moral clarity that doesn't announce itself in advance. It just acts when the moment calls for it. I spent a lot of years thinking of myself as a decent man, and I believe I am. But decency without the willingness to speak, when speaking costs something, is only half the job. Patrick understood that in a way I hadn't at 28, that I'm still learning at 63. And then there's my stepdaughter. The fact that she called me, the fact that she sat across from me at her own kitchen table 8 days after her wedding and said the words plainly and without excuse-making, that took something. Not everyone has it in them to do that, to look at their own behavior clearly without flinching and name it. I respected it more than I could easily say. What I've come to understand is this: the way things turn out is rarely accidental. My wife laughed in that room because she'd been allowed for a long time not to think too carefully about the cost of things. Financial costs, yes, but also the other kind, the cost to a person's sense of being seen. When I finally said plainly what I needed, not in anger, but in simple clarity, things shifted, not overnight, but they shifted, because honesty applied consistently tends to do that. It moves things. I'm not a man who believes the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, but I do believe that what you put out tends, eventually, to come back around, not as magic, but as consequence. I put out silence for too long. The consequence of that was being treated as though I had nothing to say. When I started speaking, the consequence was different. I built a deck once, and I did it right, and it has lasted. I think that's the only philosophy I've got.